Welcome to the Industrial Problem Seminar. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Lande and Luke Jacobsen from Medtronics. And we're going to talk about quantitative careers in the medical device industry.
So thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. We're going to start and kind of give you, and my name is Jeff Lande, and I'm here with Luke Jacobsen, and both of us are at Medtronics. We are clinical statisticians within the cardiac rhythm management group, and we'll talk. I'll talk about what we'll start broadly and talk broadly about what we do, what types of quantitative careers are at Medtronics. And then we're going to narrow more and more into some examples of projects that we work on that I think will be helpful to convey what it's like. I was talking to a small group of people. Some of them are here today, here in the audience. It's very dynamic, so it's hard to say exactly what we do. But these are some good examples that we're going to bring that give you a general idea of what types of projects we're working on. I can give you a broad background of myself. Actually, my PhD is not in statistics or math. It's in molecular, cellular, developmental biology, genetics. I wound up working on a bioinformatics project where we were trying to predict outcomes after a lung transplant, looking at genetic biomarkers, so gene expression microarray biomarkers, and predicting, what type of predictions could we do based on genetic samples and expression, gene expression patterns. What could we do to predict who was likely to have good versus bad outcomes following a lung transplant? Before that degree, long ago, I got a master's in statistics, and before that, a BS in mathematics and economics. The mathematics, that was kind of in the area of actuarial mathematics, which was good because a lot of what I do right now is in the area of survival analysis, and so that gave me a good background there. Here's a few things that I do. I wind up at this point more than anything else driving my kids around to sports activities. So, but here and there I do some things for fun. I've been at Medtronics for 15 years. I started at Medtronics as a scientist, where I was doing a lot of work in terms of similar to what I was talking about with lung transplant research, trying to find genetic biomarkers for identifying risk of sudden cardiac death. And the application there will be a little bit more obvious when I get into some of the therapies that we have at Medtronics. Before that, I was at the U of M. Before I did my molecular biology work at U of M, I had a few jobs after my my master's degree. So I'll hand it over to Luke at this point.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, it is working. Okay. So I got a master's in statistics from U of M, and went to St. Olaf College before that. And just talking about some of the interests. I don't have kids to haul around, which means I have more time for my own interests, I guess. I spend a lot of time just doing things outside, biking, skiing. I like to run. I played broom ball last night and things like that. And then something that I've picked up since graduating, I really never read for fun when I was in college or high school or even in grad school, but it's I don't know, once it's not for work and textbooks and stuff, reading. I enjoy it now. And yeah, so I have been at Medtronics for a little over 3 years, in the same group as Jeff, and I've been in this group the whole time. prior to Medtronic, I was at an internship with something called Savvy Sherpa. It was a startup that was acquired by United Health Group. And it was a pretty interesting summer, actually. It was the summer, or they were acquired between the time I accepted the internship and like it was announced that they were being acquired, and the summer kind of occurred. It was interesting to see how that worked from a 50-person company to joining a company of 250,000 employees. So, but yeah, that was an interesting experience. And prior to that, as an undergrad, I had a few internships at US Bank, but that's pretty unrelated now to what I do. So let's see. Yeah, so Jeff, mentioned we're gonna just start by kind of talking big picture at Medtronic, what some of the opportunities and just quantitative careers there are. We have statistical careers. And that first column, clinical statistician, maybe clinical biostatistician, maybe is what we should have there, is what we do. And it's probably, kind of the most thoroughly statistics role at Medtronic. So, what we do is we're involved in the design of clinical trials, largely. That's kind of one of our core functions. And, some of the things around that, of course, are like sample size estimation and just general methodology, what it's going to look like, how randomization and many different aspects to clinical trials, depending on what the need is. But then parts that, I didn't really think about while I was in grad school until really on the job is how much work there is in for someone quantitative in overseeing the execution of a trial. And one of the first projects I was put on was a multi-year post-market study. So it was going to take many years, enrolling a lot of patients, just more of a surveillance than anything. And it was just starting up when I joined. And it was kind of like, all right, it's up and running. In my head, I was like, there's not much for us to do now. But it's amazing how much there is to do, just getting data from one place to another, to a place that we need, be able to see it, how to handle, like patients not being like on protocol, and how all of those have different implications for the analyses. So there's a lot more work than I initially realized in that overseeing or kind of clinical trial overview. And then the last two, so every clinical trial will end with a clinical study report that's generally for regulatory bodies, and evidence from that is disseminated in literature and publications and conferences and things like that. But one additional note on that evidence dissemination is, while a lot of our job is kind of well-funded, large clinical prospective trials, some of our work is now kind of diving into using retrospective data analysis, data sources, or real-world data sources to try to generate additional evidence. It's we'll give a little. That's kind of the Jeff will be talking in depth about a more traditional, large prospective trial, and I'll be giving a quick talk on an example of this retrospective data analysis. And and then so that I'll probably spoke the most about that. We know the most about it because that's what we do. There's another area of that is industrial statistician. So we manufacture many devices, and in any kind of manufacturing capacity, there's statisticians for like optimization and making sure quality standards are reached and things like that. And so that, I think maybe a lot of people have the title of statistician potentially, but that probably has a much wider like quantitative background in that role. And then the last one probably has the widest kind of backgrounds in the AI development field. So in the next, it's been happening for the last 10 to 20 years, and it'll continue for the next few decades, that we'll be able to improve therapies a lot through just new methods in AI and the amount of data that we collect in the healthcare space. So there's a lot of examples across Medtronic. I just do a very quick outside of our group, like Medtronic works on something called the pill cam, and it's it's like a ingestible camera that then takes pictures of wherever it goes through, and that's many hours of videos and pictures that a physician can't just sit for a single patient and go through and look at all of those. So there are AI algorithms to pick out, potentially, like the whatever the physician was looking for. Or at least that's the future hope. But there's many examples in cardiac rhythm management space that Jeff will do a quick background on. And anywhere there's data, there's an opportunity for getting new, better therapies. So yeah, that's a high level just description of some opportunities that Medtronic works in. So I'll hand it back to Jeff.
Right. So I'm sure a question that many of you have is, what are we looking for? What are we looking for when we're hiring new statisticians? Or I'll be speaking within the clinical statistics group. What are we looking for when we bring a new statistician in? And at the top of the list is the ability to communicate across different audiences. We need to be able to communicate with each other. Oftentimes we're working on projects with a group of statisticians. We regularly, the broader group of clinical statisticians within the cardiac rhythm management group, we get together. We've had one thing that I really like about our group is, a lot of people like to help other people within the group. So we have what we call SMART meetings, and it's an acronym for something, and I can't remember what it is, but it gets all the statisticians together, and we work with each other. And you need to be able to communicate quickly. What is the issue that you're trying to solve? What's hard about that issue? And then other statisticians need to be able to communicate and say, okay, here's something maybe I've done in the past, maybe that has application here. And we work together to try to solve pretty hard problems. And some of them can be very statistical, mathematical. Some of them can be more specific around methodologies or working with what's called device database. And I'll talk device data, and I'll get into that shortly. We work with researchers, scientists, engineers. We're helping to come up. The groups that we're working with in terms of designing clinical trials. We broadly want to make sure that things are safe and effective, and we need to communicate with them and really make sure that we're getting to a testable hypothesis and work together, come up with a good way in order to design a clinical trial that gets to that particular hypothesis and shows that something is safe or that it's effective. And so, that involves us having to learn a lot of potentially specific subject matter outside of statistics and work with those researchers in order to formulate hypotheses. Then there's a clinical study team. Once we take something from an idea and a methodology, we need to actually execute a clinical trial, and we need to be able to communicate with a large matrix of people that are working on executing that clinical trial. We need to work with management. They oftentimes need to understand what we need in order to do our jobs. They want to know if they're weighing different clinical trials. They're oftentimes looking to us to help. Where are we going to potentially run into issues in executing a trial? What's the probability that this is going to fail? All sorts of questions, and we need to effectively communicate with management, and then physician collaborators. This we get all sorts of different physicians. Being cardiac rhythm, we're working a lot with cardiologists and electrophysiologists. And some of them are very savvy, knowledgeable in clinical trials and statistics. Some of them aren't so much. We work with lots of different personalities, and we need to be able to communicate effectively with them. As I was kind of talking before, we need to have a pretty wide knowledge domain. So it's not enough just to know the math and the statistics. We need to know about physiology, anatomy, engineering. For me, I'll talk about some work that I did. I need to know a lot about infectious disease. So just a huge amount of information. We need to at least have some idea and how to apply mathematical and statistical concepts within those domains. We need to be able to work very independently, and we need to be able to work in a team. Then programming, a lot of people, what do we need to be programming in? Our group does a lot of work with SAS and R, we want people to have at least SAS or R in order to come in. And usually if you're really good at SAS or really good at R, you can develop, you have the skills in order to develop the other one. So knowing both is definitely helpful. But whatever you program in, good programming practices, and I said that we need to work collaboratively, and good programming practices, being able to write code not only that does what you need to be, not only to do what you're supposed to do with the code, but you need to be able to have comments in there to explain what are you doing within that code, so that somebody who hasn't been involved at all can pretty quickly come in there and understand it. And we get audited by regulatory agencies, so they may look at the code and we need to explain what that did, and we have statisticians validate each other's programs. So you need to make it pretty clear so that when somebody's validating your code, they know exactly what you're trying to do. And like I said, flexibility to work with different tools and applications. R and SAS for sure. Python is becoming more of a necessity for a lot of the things that we do day to day. And then prioritization skills. I talked to a few people today about some of the things I'm working on. All of us within our group are working on multiple different projects at any one time. We need to be able to figure out what are the priorities? What do you need to get done right away? What do you have a little bit more flexibility? And that's not easy, but being able to do that is very critical to keeping all of our projects going. So I'm going to give you enough background into what we have within cardiac rhythm management to kind of give you, when I'm talking about the examples of what we do, having enough background here will be helpful. So we have this first page are our major therapy groups. And so the therapies, these are treating cardiac conditions. The first area is kind of the oldest area. Our company was founded on pacing, so pacemakers, and back in the 1940s, some work was done to create a pacemaking system that didn't need to be plugged into an electrical source. It's an entirely implantable system. And we also call the pacemakers IPG, so implantable pulse generators. And the way that the traditional pacemakers work is that you've got a generator, and that's we call it a can, and that's this. You see my cursor? So this is the generator. It's kind of the brains of the operation. Any algorithms that are applied are within chips within the generator. It's got the battery. And then it's got some connectors within it so that you connect what are called leads, and these are wires that so going back, the generator is usually implanted kind of right above the heart, and then these leads are connected, and those go through veins, and then the leads go through the veins actually into the heart, and then the leads then are fixed into cardiac tissue. And so at that point, the leads are both bringing in information and delivering therapies. So we need to really quickly understand what is happening within the heart tissue. We every single beat that the heart goes through, your heart beats millions of times every day, and we have to understand exactly what's going on from all the waveforms, and understand when something happens that shouldn't happen. And so with pacemakers, usually the issue is what we call bradycardia, so a slower heartbeat, or there's some type of a block where the the heart tissue isn't conveying the electrical signal the way it should. Something is happening where maybe the intrinsic pacing ability of the heart is no longer functioning, and so we're delivering the regular heartbeat. And like I said, the traditional generator and lead system has been around for a long time. One of our newest products is called Micra, and that's what's called a leadless system. So rather than having leads that go through the veins, the Micra is a tiny little generator, and that can get directly implanted into the heart, so you no longer have the lead. So because it's connected right to the tissues, you still are able to sense and deliver the pacing therapy, but you don't have the lead system. Here I have one particular type of lead. We have a lot of different types of leads, which vary in their shapes and sizes and how they fixate into cardiac tissue. And I also have, there's a catheter system. So not only do you have the lead, but you need to have a system for getting that lead implanted. One of the things that I'll be talking about, one of the issues with having a system with the lead, the leads can have problems because there's the pocket. You can have an infection within the section where the generator is implanted. The lead can break. It can dislocate from the heart, and so these are all issues that we try to track, and the infection portion winds up being important for something I'll be explaining a little bit. Defibrillators. So if you've ever seen like a hospital show where they have the defibrillators. So if there is a very fast rhythm, should say the heart has 4 different chambers, two atria and 2 ventricles. And if you have a very fast rhythm in the ventricle, or if it just isn't, if it goes out of, I guess, control, you don't have very much time. You probably followed on the Buffalo Bills had one of their players a few weeks ago had a cardiac arrhythmia. Now that was something probably had to do with him getting hit very hard, but some people have kind of genetic issues that give them higher chances of having a spontaneous arrhythmia. And so these are designed to be implantable defibrillators that shock you back into rhythms. There's also what we call a low power therapy, anti-tachycardia pacing, where you don't have to shock, but what you can kind of do is capture if there's a fast rhythm, it's a little hard to understand if you don't have the background, but if you've got a fast rhythm, what this therapy does is it is an even faster rhythm, but when the device delivers this fast rhythm, it gets control over the heart, and then you can draw back so that you get to a more reasonable rhythm that's not life-threatening. ICDs also have leads. And then the final therapy, major therapy group is cardiac resynchronization therapy. And there's actually different types of heart failure, but the type of heart failure is relevant here is when kind of the chambers of the heart are not in synchrony with each other. And so then the pumping function of the heart is very, very inefficient. And so the CRT, cardiac resynchronization therapy, paces both the right side and the left side of the heart so that gets the heart back into synchrony. These also have leads, and there's different flavors of cardiac rhythm of CRT. There's CRTP and CRTD. CRTD has the defibrillator function in addition to the biventricular pacing function. And again, these also have leads. Okay, this page is meant to, I'm not going to go into as much detail here. Kind of these are newer product lines. The first, cardiac monitors, ICMs, cardiac monitors, new product called Link. This doesn't deliver a therapy, but what it does do is it's a very, very small, it's what we call injectable device, and it tracks, it's a diagnostic. So it identifies if a patient has some type of rhythm that puts them at risk, where one of the therapies that I just discussed could be helpful or life-saving for them. Everything that I talked about previously was mainly having to do with ventricular rhythms, and those the ventricular rhythms tend to be more, if something goes wrong with your ventricular rhythm, you're at more acute risk versus atrial arrhythmias. So rhythm issues with the atrium aren't as acutely problematic, but they can lead to embolisms or strokes. And so having these diagnostics is really useful for physicians in order to manage patients with atrial tachycardia, atrial fibrillation. This AccuRhythm, this is a great example of an AI technology. So all of our therapies, like I said, they're sensing what's happening with the heart. And so there's an immediate algorithm within the device that immediately tells the device what therapies to apply. What this is, AccuRhythm is more broadly looking across not just what's within that rhythm, but across all of the different rhythms that we're collecting over time. So we have an enormous database of rhythms to choose from, and using that broader knowledge in order to even get more specific in classifying rhythms. And that winds up being very useful for patient management. Focus On is an example of, there's an enormous amount of information that the device is collecting on a daily basis, and it can get really complicated for physicians to know who is it at quote unquote relatively high risk and relatively low risk. And so this is an example of coming up with, and this is kind of a really new concept, but it's a way to provide clinics with kind of a triage system for identifying patients at relatively high risk versus those at relatively low risk, and helps to make clinics more efficient. Patient management, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, other than more and more patient management involves working with AI technology, data science type ideas in order to improve patient management. The last point here is procedure innovations. Now, I talked about leads and how the systems and all of the three therapies that I showed on the previous page, IPGs, ICDs, and CRTs, all of those have infection risk. And so we have something called the Tyrex envelope, which is an envelope, you put that generator into the envelope when you implant it, and it elutes antibiotics, which decrease the chances of a patient having an infection. And this is a study that I worked on quite a bit. Wound up being a very, very large study, almost 7,000 patients. It was worldwide, majority of those being in United States, Canada, and Europe, but a very, very large study. And again, this is a randomized trial of that Tyrex envelope. You know, it's a simple trial in terms of, does this envelope effectively decrease the risk of infection or not? And it's 1-to-1 randomization of whether or not patients receive the envelope or not. Oops. When I was working on the RAPID study, I can give you an example of what was the day-to-day work on this study. And the way that our department is set up is we have different statisticians have different roles within the study, especially the larger studies, and this is a very large study. So there's a consultant statistician, which is more on the designing this, what is the methodology, making sure that we're coming up with the best methodologies, inclusion and exclusion, who should and shouldn't be in the study in order to isolate. So we really want to isolate the effect of whether that envelope works or not. So we want to exclude patients if they have an existing infection. It can be really, really difficult to understand whether the envelope has an effect or not if there is an already existing infection. So we want to exclude patients with existing infections. And there's a lot of other inclusions and exclusions, really to make sure that we were able, as best as possible, isolate the effect of this envelope. We had to develop, the consultant generally works to devise the statistical analysis plan, and in this particular, and each study can be kind of different in terms of what the consultant does, what the project statistician does. And actually, when I was working on this, I went from project statistician to consultant statistician. So I wound up working a little bit on developing the statistical plan, and actually drafting it out, and then writing out all the details. You oftentimes want to be really, really as specific as possible within your design of the study, down to you know, a tie-breaking methodology for a particular. If we're doing a particular test, what's the exact specifications for that test? So we want to get really specific so that we want to be really, really clear what is the methodology that we're using in order to test our hypothesis. What do we do about multiple comparisons? All of that we need to get really, really specific about. And then we work, also the consultants usually work directly with the internal and external partners. I work with a lot of different physicians and infectious disease experts, and that's both in terms of designing the study, and then once we have the results, working with them to work on evidence dissemination. Project statistician, again, works a lot to develop the code, to create tables and figures and listings for both the reports that we're doing, and then some of the some of the figures for publications. And then on top of that, we have statistical programmers, and they're not within the statistics group itself. They're kind of in a different entity, but they're oftentimes working with us, writing programs. So you know, all of our studies, almost all of our studies are pulling information from sites. And so usually there's like a coordinator at a hospital or at a site where they're enrolling patients, and they're entering information onto we call it a CRF, case report form. So all of the information about the patient, what type of medical history background, what are all the components within their system, therapeutic system, the IPG or the CRT or the ICD device. They're entering all that information, and the statistical programmer will write programs to pull all that in and eventually create a really nice data set so that we can do our analysis on it. And they're oftentimes applying logic and creating a really easy to use data set, so that when we're writing code to create figures or to implement the statistics to test our hypotheses, that we can do that. Okay, so back to the rapid study itself, almost 7,000 patients, and we allowed patients who got any of those 3 devices that I described earlier, and we allowed patients who had what's called the de novo device, so the first device that they've ever gotten, or if they're getting, so sometimes these, because these are all devices that rely on batteries, the batteries don't last forever. And so patients sometimes need to be brought back in and have the device explanted and have a new device implanted. That's called a replacement. And then some patients are upgraded. I said that there's CRT and ICD. Some patients may initially have a CRT-P device. So that's the cardiac resynchronization therapy with only the pacing. They can get to the point where they get increased risk of having a ventricular arrhythmia, and when that happens, they might go from a CRT-P device to a CRT-D device. And we allowed all of those different patients to be implanted in the study. And one of the questions is the envelope just as effective across all these different types of therapy? Is 1-to-1 randomization, and our primary objective was, does this envelope reduce infections through 12 months of follow-up? And then we had some secondary objectives around the safety. Were there complex? So one of the questions would be, okay, you had this envelope, but do you have other complications that are happening because you're adding this additional step of using an envelope? Is there a trade-off between the protection of infection and the development of additional complications? So that was something we're looking at. We're looking at not only the primary objective was infections in 12 months, but then we looked at we allowed patients we had patients up to 3 years of follow-up. And so we're looking over their entire life or the entire follow-up span of that patient. Was there a decrease in infections? Then we also looked at major and minor infections. And then we also, because this was such a large study, we have these alerts. So the leads, I said that the leads can have issues in terms of dislodging or breaking. There were some of these alerts, and we wanted to make test some objectives around these lead alerts. And kind of as I get into here, the lead alert portion, that's just one of many, there was all the different objectives that we had. There's a whole series of manuscripts that wound up coming out of the work that we did. To the left, the main thing that we're testing, whether the envelope was effective, that wound up going to the New England Journal of Medicine, which is kind of the most prestigious place that you can go to for a clinical trial. And so that you know, there was a lot of work to do that one. And then we had another publication around the long-term follow-up, which was one of those secondary objectives that we looked at. And then this performance of lead monitoring diagnostics, those were ancillary objectives of our study. We had another publication. And so each of these publications, you know, the first couple of publications were very hypothesis driven, standard statistical analyses. And then as we started moving, there's just a number of different areas of statistics and AI, and we wound up touching on healthcare economics. So there were two publications that we did, and so we had to collaborate with healthcare economics people and take in not only the information about the overall infections, but tie that in with kind of the enormous amount of information that we collected from sites about hospitalizations and kind of issues that happened related to their systems. The point I'm trying to make here is that it's not just the initial hypothesis-driven analysis that we were working on. We got into broader and broader, and so each of these analyses wound up using kind of different mathematical and statistical skills. Then we started getting in. One of our publications was in the area of microbiology, and back when I said that you have to have a large domain, we wound up having to go into a lot of detail on the microbiology and work with infectious disease experts in order to do that analysis. Then we had several studies that we published on hematomas. And there we wound up doing more model building. We did, you're probably familiar with the lasso modeling. We did a lot of modeling. In order to do that, we had to, there's a lot of work that we did to kind of work with all of the data that we collected. And kind of, because it wasn't directly the hypothesis, there's a lot of work that we did in terms of designing the data set to answer that question more specifically. And then, yeah, the risk factors for infection, again, this wound up being more of a predictive modeling question. And I think that's all I have, and I will pass it back to.
Is it 215 or 225? Or be somewhere okay, yeah, sounds good. Okay, yeah, so I'm just gonna give a quick background on a little bit of a different type of project. So you know, this did not have prospectively randomized or gathered data, and it's called GLIDE HF, which stood for Guideline Indications Detected in EHR for Heart Failure. And so the big picture is there's prior kind of outdated studies showing that a lot of patients with heart failure that are indicated for our ICDs and CRTDs. So the defibrillating devices. A lot of patients that were indicated for those were not getting them. And what we found is with this EHR database, it gave us an opportunity to evaluate this in a novel way and with more recent data. Because the prior studies were like from like 2008 or so. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about what the data is. We contract with a company called Optum that is here in the Minneapolis area. And so they're a company, like a healthcare technology company. They provide a lot of different services to hospital systems for like collecting and analyzing their EHR. And then what they do on top of that is they let patients, there's like I don't know, you sign if you want early when you get into a healthcare system, whether you're okay with your data being used for in a de-identified way in health or life science research. And for all those patients that consent, Optum then standardizes across many providers and healthcare systems, standardizes the electronic health records and sell it to research institutions. And Medtronic is just one of the customers. So I have a figure here that just kind of shows, gives an idea of the type of data we can see. So if you're like a patient that has an outpatient visit, like, small procedure, we'll see that procedure and any tests that were done from that visit. Or lab values, medications, if it's prescribed, we'll see that they're prescribed. There is some clinician notes that we just see it's NLP extracted data because to prevent there from being any de-identification or being able to identify accidentally. They only are able to provide it in a way that has been extracted. And then, we get things like hospitalizations and some outcomes. So, certainly mortality is generally recorded in EHR. And I think they get it from the Social Security Index as well. But other outcomes like that, I guess, are like lab measurements and hospitalizations. Okay. So going back to this analysis, the motivating question is just what % of patients are indicated for ICDs and CRTDs that actually receive them. And the high level, so I guess first I should talk, what does this mean to be indicated? Make sure we're on the same page here. So based on prior clinical research, groups of physicians or societies like the Heart Rhythm Society, and I don't remember what ACC stands for, but cardiac college of cardiology. Yeah. They publish guidelines, and here I have this example of the table that they break it down into size of treatment effect. So with class 1 and 2A, meaning that it's clearly more beneficial than the risks involved, and also the estimate of certainty. So with A, meaning there are many multiple clinical trials and many meta-analyses showing a clear benefit. B being maybe there's one trial, and C being like it's expert opinion or a few case studies. And the thing about ICDs, CRTDs, they've been around quite a while now, and Medtronic, our competitors, and probably government institutions have run quite a few studies on it. So for certain populations, there is class 1A evidence for the benefit for things like mortality and other endpoints. So the goal of this analysis was, can we use the Optum electronic health records to determine if a patient is indicated based on these guidelines, and then also use the EHR to identify whether they got an implant of one of these devices through their procedure codes. We would see a procedure for one of these implants. So the results from this, not going into details on this slide, but just to show the kind of complexity into creating these indication, or what are called phenotyping, computable phenotypes. So it's a way to tell a computer whether someone's has an indication or not. This was developed in collaboration with electrophysiologists, kind of, okay, if a patient has these records, can we safely say they are indicated? versus not. And then there's just a lot of different logic that goes into each of those and what's available and what's not in each source. And when we get to the results, we found that 41% of class 1 and class 2A indicated patients for CRTDs are implanted, but or receive a CRTD implant, but a much lower percent, 15, receive that are indicated for ICDs, receive an ICD implant. And I have kind of the primary result here presented. We broke down the indications a little bit into something that'll take quite a while to describe. This was published in something called American Heart Journal Plus, Cardiology Research and Practice. This is not the New England Journal of Medicine. And part of that, just to reason of why that is, compared to a prospective trial enrolling 6,000 patients randomly assigning, there are pretty significant limitations of this type of research. Much lower cost, though, much quicker, and the data was already available. But one of the biggest things is that first bullet is that, so Optum is standardizing EHR across many hospital systems, and we can just see that. And when we look at individual patients, a lot of questions can arise of like, what's going on here? Why is this collected this way? And we can't go back to the source and say, hey, what's going on with this patient? For many reasons, but the big one being it's de-identified. So there's no way for us to even know what that source is, who that patient is, and it'd be a very large privacy violation to try to figure it out. Unlike in a clinical trial, these are patients, we are able, in a trial, we're able to say, hey, go back to the site and say, this implant date says 1990, but they enrolled in 2010. What's happening? They maybe made a key error, they can fix that. If I see an implant that's in the future, there's nothing I can do with that. I don't know what to make of it. There's maybe an input error that there's no way I can get to the bottom of it. Non-randomized, of course, so it's hard to be confident of generalizing onto the population we would intend to generalize on in the US, patients with heart failure. And then I think I'll just touch on the last bullet quickly. So the phenotyping algorithm, we spent a lot of time on that, going through, trying to figure out who's indicated, working with physicians to do that. But we don't have like a subset of data where we can validate the algorithm on. One thing that's difficult is that there are a portion of indications that you can't just get from EHR. So there are things we can, like they have a left ventricular ejection fraction below 35. Well, if we see a lab test where it said their LVEF was 20, we know that they have that below 35. But some in our indications for our devices, there's like a reasonable expectation that they have life expectancy, like a high quality of life greater than 1 year. We can't necessarily phenotype that out of EHR. I mean, we made some attempts, like certain late stage cancers, we would not consider them indicated, but someone with a cancer that they're able to treat, and many people live many years after getting diagnosed with cancer. So you can't just say anybody with cancer would fit that description. And so that there's just a lot of uncertainty around the phenotyping algorithm development, and that leads to it's not as strong as scientific or compelling as evidence then. But yeah, so I think I kept that pretty quick, but that was the last thing I had on that, and we'll just move on to any questions on any of the things we've talked about. Thank you. My eye online if anybody asks anything. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've worked with the same Optum.
Oh yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Did you actually end up using any of the NLP data, or were you able to? Because I feel like when I worked with it, there were a lot of questions about
Yes.
It was like extracted that maybe statistically this is like the best data to use.
Yeah, no, so that's interesting. We spent quite a bit of time working with Optum to ask them about like what since you guys have the actual notes, you can run tests to say the manual review, what is your precision or area under curve type of thing for these algorithms, and they wouldn't provide that to us. It was used in some ways for it as like a we can't see it on, but there's some sub multiple bullets where it's like we use maybe a description of symptoms of heart failure in addition to another thing that would be more likely to be heart failure. So I think that was about the only thing we used it for. Oh yeah, another aspect was there's something called the New York Heart
Association.
Oh, it is just a Heart Association heart failure risk score that's just 1 through 4. And that's not something that like comes up in diagnosis codes or anything. But if we saw that in EHR that it was NYHA 2, we would use that as a yes, they have medium symptoms of heart failure. So yeah, we used it in extremely simple cases, I would say. Yeah.
I did something actually quite similar.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that was the sort of thing that was like, well, if they had something that had an NYHA 4 or 3, it maybe lowered the threshold how many different types of diagnoses we needed to also see to get an indication. Yeah.
I had a question earlier on. You were talking about like different kind of jobs at Medtronics, like clinical statistician or like AI developer. Just curious, like, are there more jobs in one group, or like do you hire more people with like a statistical background, like a AI background, or are those pretty evenly spread?
So the question is, we talked about clinical statisticians, more AI development, and whether we hire more versus. So maybe to answer that, the clinical statistics department is definitely more clear what our projects are and what our staffing needs are. The AI development is itself in development, so it's a lot of that winds up being more research, and I can't really answer that question because the research, the AI development oftentimes happens in the research group, and I'm not sure a lot of the people within there are not necessarily data scientists. A lot of them come from engineering backgrounds and decide, I know enough about statistics and AI that I'm going to start to, they're working on specific methods for, quickly understanding how to interpret cardiac rhythm signals and then translating that into a therapy or withholding therapy. And now when you talk about more broadly answering AI questions, they have enough of a background in the understanding how to work with waveforms so we're not necessarily hiring new people to do that. It's the people that are already there are doing that, versus in the clinical group we have specific studies that we're working on that need to be have people attributed to them, and so you're more likely to be hired directly as a statistician versus the AI work. A lot of them are coming from internal and working on pet projects. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, I have a related questions because statistics nowadays are very broad topic. So you have students coming from math who have very good background in machine learning and data science, but maybe didn't take a lot of statistical design, experimental design, but they know regression and some basic ideas in statistics, and we have an example of a student who can move from similar data. So how open you are to hire students like this, not necessarily coming from statistics, practice statistics department.
Right. So the question, and you can, if you want to feel, so the question is, how.
Because you talked about job statistician.
Right.
How broad is
How,
the
yeah, how broad of a definition of statistician would we need to bring somebody in as a statistician? And so, you know, we have a lot of applicants, and if we find an applicant who hasn't maybe had that, well, I'll answer that in a few ways. Oftentimes we'll get people in through a contract position. I think both of us initially came in through a contract position. So you may come in working on a specific topic. And one thing that I'll say, probably definitely within Medtronic, they really encourage you. If you come in one area and you want to work in a different area, they very much encourage you to learn within your job. And so oftentimes you're hired to work on a specific project, and they may have very specific needs within that project. But if you have interests outside of that specific area, once you kind of get your foot in the door, there's a lot of flexibility to work on what you would like to if there's something, a need within the company and you want to go in that direction, they highly encourage you and provide enough education and resources in order to pursue that.
And maybe more directly, like, so I think in our role, clinical stats, I mean, we probably would consider a math student if they had some kind of the basic stat coursework, graduate level background, I would imagine. And I would think as we move right, like less and less of that would be an absolute requirement. But probably in our role, there probably is a minimum necessary of, like, you know, if you have a math master's or PhD instead of stats, that doesn't mean I wouldn't think we would not consider it, but you probably would need to have something demonstrating that, like, understanding of statistical theory. But you know, you've been involved in hiring more than I have, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you know,
Yeah.
oftentimes we have a very specific need, and we'll try to find somebody who has a background that specifically fills that need. For example, there's a project that's going on, and we need somebody to you know, oftentimes you're replacing somebody who has left, and they're working on something where they were writing some SAS code to do X analysis. And so we need somebody who has enough of a background to work on that analysis. So in a case like that, it winds up being, you know, we'll want somebody who has probably a background in SAS and enough of a background in whatever type of analysis that they need for that. So it's oftentimes the reason they're able to get the position in the first place is because there is a specific analysis or a project that we're looking for a fit for that.
Thank you. This is helpful. Yeah, so thanks again. And if you have more questions, there's going to be follow-up sessions. Because we're waiting at 4 or 5.
Okay.
Thanks.